Today on BenchBriefs, we're looking at a landmark case that explores the intersection of Indigenous rights and commercial activity in Canada. On this episode, we dive into R.V. Gladstone, a 1996 Supreme Court of Canada decision that helped define how Aboriginal rights apply to selling natural resources. The case involves the Gladstone brothers, members of the Heiltsuk First Nation who were charged with selling herring spawn without a commercial fishing license. Herring spawn is essentially fish eggs, and in this case, it was harvested from the coastal waters of British Columbia. The Gladstones argued that their right to sell herring spawn wasn't just a matter of fishing, it was a right protected under Section 35(1) of the Constitution Act 1982. This section recognizes and affirms existing Aboriginal and treaty rights of Indigenous peoples in Canada. The dispute boiled down to whether the commercial sale of herring spawn was something the Heiltsuk people had historically done and therefore had the constitutional right to continue. Traditionally, many Indigenous communities harvested resources like fish and shellfish for sustenance, but the question here was about selling those resources for profit. Was the commercial sale of herring spawn part of the Heiltsuk's traditional practices, or was it a modern activity subject to regulation? When the Gladstone brothers sold herring spawn without a license, the government charged them, arguing that commercial fishing licenses were required to manage fish stocks and regulate the industry. The Gladstones challenged this, claiming their Aboriginal rights gave them the freedom to sell herring spawn commercially without needing a license. So, the Supreme Court was faced with several key legal questions. First, does Section 35(1) of the Constitution protect the commercial sale of herring spawn as an Aboriginal right? In other words, can an Indigenous group claim a right not just to harvest resources, but to engage in commercial activities related to those resources? Second, how should courts define the scope of Aboriginal rights, especially when it comes to activities that may have a historical basis but have evolved over time? The court needed to decide if a commercial practice could be recognized as an Aboriginal right if it had roots in traditional use, even if it wasn't identical to past practices. Finally, the court had to consider how far the Crown's regulatory powers extend. To what extent can the government regulate or restrict Aboriginal commercial fishing rights in order to conserve resources or manage the fishery? In its ruling, the Supreme Court recognized that Aboriginal rights do include the right to engage in commercial activities, but with important limits. The court found that the Heiltsuk people had historically harvested and traded herring spawn, and that this commercial aspect was part of their traditional practices. Therefore, the commercial sale of herring spawn was an Aboriginal right protected under Section 35(1). However, the court also emphasized that such rights are not absolute. The government can regulate Aboriginal commercial rights to ensure conservation and sustainability, but any restrictions must be justified and must respect the unique nature of those rights. This case is significant because it marked a shift in how Aboriginal rights are understood in relation to economic activities. Before Gladstone, Aboriginal rights were often seen primarily as subsistence or cultural rights, activities done for personal or community use rather than for profit. Gladstone acknowledged that Indigenous peoples have the right to participate in commercial activities tied to their traditional practices, recognizing the importance of economic self-sufficiency and development. By clarifying that commercial rights can be constitutionally protected, the decision paved the way for Indigenous communities across Canada to assert their rights in fisheries, forestry, and other resource-based industries. It also set out a framework for balancing those rights with conservation and regulatory objectives. In short, R.V. Gladstone is a foundational case in Canadian Aboriginal law that helps define how traditional Indigenous practices translate into modern economic rights. It confirms that Indigenous peoples can claim the right to sell natural resources commercially, but that right must be managed responsibly in the public interest. Thanks for listening to this episode of Bench Briefs. Join us next time as we explore another important case shaping Canadian law. Until then, take care.